If you want to be a startup founder, then your ultimate goal is to get here, which is the front page of Producthunt. This is a site, if you haven't heard of it, that really is where most of the cool, exciting software gets launched on the internet today. And so we're going to take a look at what you need to do to end up here if you are a founder with an idea that you want to test out, but you're not exactly sure how to build it. And let's say you don't know how to code either. So we're going to look today at 3 of the best, in my opinion, and some of the most popular tools to build startups. And we're going to talk about when to use which, because we have 3 candidates here that are all really great at doing one particular thing. There is Card, which is a great drag and drop builder for static web pages with some dynamic functionality. We have Webflow, which can actually function as a makeshift database and input and accept different data. And then Bubble, which is the most powerful of the 3, but does not have as great of design capabilities. But before we get through all these different tools and talk about which use case makes the most sense depending on what your idea is, let's go back to the beginning and start back at Producthunt. So the first thing that you're going to notice if you scroll through the front page of Producthunt is that startups here, especially if they're software, can be put into about 3 different categories. So we're going to start out with the most basic, which is just an upcoming landing page. If you click on one of these tools, you will see here that essentially you're just getting a landing page with some copy and a form. And the whole goal here is if you're a really early stage company, you just put some text here. You're trying to get someone to subscribe and learn more about your idea to test it out. And then all you want to do is get some info. Now, these pages can look a little bit different depending on what your goal is. This could be a pre-order page, for example, if it's a product or service, or it could just be asking for your email. So let's go back now because that is just one example. The second example that you're going to see is something that's a little bit more complex. We can classify this second category, even though it's a little bit more loose, as content or curation websites. So here's a good example here, this one called Phantom Buster. So it calls itself a marketplace, and if you scroll through some of the screenshots, you can see here that it's essentially giving you a list, a curated list of some of the best no-code APIs. Let's click into a related product, also about APIs. You'll see here that this is essentially just taking content and curating it. Now, everything from a blog to a Stack website, which have been pretty popular recently, use this really basic framework, which is we collect data potentially from our users or just from a set of curators, and we display them on a website. And so that is what we're going to be looking into as our second category, curation websites. And then third, you have your full-fledged software. So, for example, this software here called Slides is a full-fledged SaaS software platform, meaning it's software as a service. You go ahead and you create an account, and the actual software here is helping you create a new kind of PowerPoint for a pitch deck. And it's very different than a landing page or a content site because you're actually interacting with a lot of different data materials. This is displaying data in a really cool way, and that's its whole value prop there. With that said, we really just have a good idea of really the broad category that can fit into this. Anything that requires something like a user to log in and some really complex functionality, that's usually a full-fledged software product. So we have something like Slides, we have something like Phantom Buster, and we have something like Lifetime Deals, all 3 different versions of product from the most early stage to the most advanced. So those are really 3 loose categories, and we're going to go through why each of these tools can really fall into one of those categories, but there will be some crossover. And so a lot of what is really helpful here, looking at this chart I just spun up, is what you need to display to a user and what your main goal of testing this idea is. So let's start out with Card. Card is really a great tool for displaying static content. And by that, I mean just anything that's on a website that you can see, click on, interact with lightly, but you can't log in, you can't really play around with, you can't customize because the data is mostly static. But what a card site is great for is that you can submit dynamic data. So dynamic is something that changes, static, something that does not. And what we're trying to get at here is that your idea, if it needs to really just collect feedback, collect signups, even collect payments as its main functionality, as its main goal, Card is perfect for this use case. Now, if you need something that's a little bit more dynamic, you can move toward Webflow and Bubble, which we'll talk about in a bit. But the most important concept to realize this early on is if you have a startup idea, you don't necessarily need to pick just one of these categories. Ideally, you would go through all three or maybe two, where you'd start out with a landing page to collect some information and then build it out to something a little bit more complex, maybe even a separate project that is displaying content related to the software that you eventually want to build. The whole idea here is that you should gradually be building an audience around your idea so that you can get support, get ideas, get feedback so that your idea ends up being actually successful instead of the thousands of startup ideas that end up in the graveyard. That being said, let's dive into Card a little bit so you can really see what I'm talking about here. So we're inside a new project on card.co. Remember, it's with 2 R's. And all I did was I used one of their templates to create a very, very basic site. So if you ever use something like Squarespace or Wix, you should be fairly familiar with how this type of drag and drop editor works, where all you really do is you have a tab over here where you can update and edit what gets displayed here on the website, and then you can drag things around if you want to display them in different ways. One of the reasons I really love Card is that the sites look great. They have really nicely designed templates. And if you look at this element panel here, you can find almost everything you need to display a wide variety of data to folks. And you can get some dynamic data back from them. So if we look at the form element, I believe there's already one in this page right here, get notified. So for this example, we're just going to go through and figure out something that's an idea that's related to the restaurant industry. So we're going to start out by just gathering folks together in the restaurant industry by getting a restaurant insider newsletter together. Let's call it something like that. So ideally, when someone would click learn more, it would navigate them down to this form over here, or we could just get rid of all these different sections. But the main point of this website is to collect the data from a user. One of the things I really like about Card is that right out of the box, you have some great integrations. So this is just a sign-up form that was generated as part of this form, and already you can see that it is ready to go connected to MailChimp or one of these other options. And if you aren't going to create a newsletter list and you just want something a little bit more simple, like if you contact or put your name on this form, I'll get it, then you can just create a contact form and specify your email address, and then whoever fills out the form, that will just go right to you, and then you can reach out to them saying, hey, it looks like you signed up for this newsletter list. I'm about to launch it. Would love to hop on a brief call to figure out what you really need so I can build the product for you. So that's what I really like about Card. And if we go back to this comparison chart that I spun up, you can see that the main feature is that it displays static content. The dynamic data and the things that change on the page all come from actually submitting information. So if you use a more advanced version of Card, you can set up Stripe or another payment processor to collect payments and credit card info right on the site. Great for maybe a pre-order page. But at the end of the day, you're not able to get dynamic data on the website. What does that mean? So let's say someone submits their sign-up information and their profile. Let's say they're adding the URL of a great website. That URL cannot then get pushed to be displayed on Card versus a site like Twitter where you write that same information, you put the URL, you click post, and then it's on that website. To do something like that and to build a curation or content-focused website, we're going to need to level up a bit. And that's where a tool like Webflow comes in really handy, because you're able to display dynamic content and you can set up the site so that it acts more like an application. A web application is really just a website that has a database where data is stored and then can be pulled and displayed back to the user. So let's take a look at Webflow and how it's able to level up and create one of these content sites using dynamic data. All right, so now we're in Webflow, and you can already see that Webflow's layout is a little bit more complex than Card, and you'll notice that as we get tools that are more powerful, there's going to be a little bit of a steeper learning curve. Now, Webflow and Bubble both have really good tutorial sites out there, and you can mostly play around and figure out some of the most basic stuff without having to dive into more of the advanced tools. Like this whole layout panel is pretty much designed for professional web designers that use this tool that really need to get everything pixel perfect for websites. But using this template that I found for free on Webflow, we want to spin up something that's a little bit more advanced than just our first restaurant newsletter, and that's a job board. So let's take a look at what a job board would entail. Well, a job board is a curation website. It's taking content, it's taking submissions potentially from users, and then it's displaying them to everyone that goes on the page. And to do this, you're going to need a database. And a database can quickly get very complex and add a lot of complexity to your application. So to help out with this, Webflow really just focuses on one type of database, which is a content management system. So over here, you'll see this little hamburger looking stack right here, and it comes preloaded with a bunch of blog posts. And these blog posts are really just database records. I can click inside and see the individual fields in the database and edit them here. And there's all sorts of different stuff, information inside of this one record. You also have team members and features, and we can create our own database collection here, which then could be job postings. So for this example, I'm just going to take blog posts and I'm just going to call it job postings. And we don't really have to worry too much about the individual fields, but we could add a field like, the URL to the restaurant, its Yelp page, the salary, the experience, all of those different fields, because that's something that the user is going to need to interact with when they submit a form that then gets displayed on the page. But here's really the major difference. If we go back to Webflow here in our page, we see that if we click around, we can get some of the normal containers. Let's click the add button here. We can get some of the normal containers and elements that Card offers, like a button, your image, or your video. But now you have the option to actually drag in dynamic data via what's called a collection list. So for example, I'm going to go ahead here and I'm going to add a collection list down here. And you'll see here that because it's highlighted in purple, this means that it's going to be dynamic content. So all I need to do is specify that this is going to be all of our job postings, and then select a layout. And just like that, everything that is on my CMS backend gets displayed on the front end, which is really cool. And then, inside of Webflow, you can go ahead and specify, for example, okay, this is a text block, and this text is going to be inside of this collection. And it can get a little bit into the weeds. I'm not going to cover it in all the different details, but for example, I'm going to go to this settings area here, and you'll see that I can get the text itself from the job postings area, and now that's all dynamic content. So here's the name, the date, etc. So this is going to be the text block here, and I'm going to just drag in an image block here. Get the image from job postings, main image. And just like that, we have a set of different collections. And the most important piece here is that this is a dynamic database, meaning, okay, we have all of this information inside of Webflow, but what happens when the page is live? We have less control, because if we delete one of these listings, it gets updated live here. If a user posts something, it gets added here. So a really good way to think about this is with dynamic data, you can submit data that's then updated dynamically on the site and then displayed to a user. A great thing about Webflow as well is that it can integrate with Zapier, which is really a tool that functions as duct tape between your different applications that holds them together and acts as kind of a back-end database pipe system that can send dynamic data through a form that's submitted on your Webflow site to the actual CMS itself. So for example, there's a really great tool out there called Airtable. So we're going to go to Airtable, not Rtable. That would be sketchy. And what you see with Airtable is that it's very much like a spreadsheet website, similar to Google Sheets. And with Google Sheets and with Airtable, you can create forms. And those forms can get embedded right on a website. So I don't have time to go through how this would actually work in its implementation, but you can imagine a site where you take a form on Airtable that's hooked up to a database here. You put the form on a Webflow site, let's say on a submit a new posting page that you create here, and then you use Zapier. Let's just type in Zapier Airtable to Webflow. And there we see some integrations. Perfect. So create a CMS item in Webflow from new Airtable record. What you do here is you would set up Zapier so that when someone submits a new record, a new job posting, it will automatically take it and then spin it back to the CMS, the very limited database that's in Webflow, and then it would get updated live on your site. So that's a lot more functionality than you can get with a tool just like Card. You can create an entire curation site or even a site with some user functionality. So users can submit posts and then they can look at posts, they can upvote them. There's a lot of things that you can do here beyond just a very poorly designed food restaurant job board. All right, so we're now getting into complex territory. And ideally, as I said before, you're kind of moving in this direction from simple to more complex as you've validated your idea. And really at the upper end here is Bubble. And Bubble is going to be a tool. If we click into the dashboard here, Bubble is a tool that is really your full-fledged no-code design development workflow editor. So there's a full database here that handles everything from user creation to creating new data fields, to creating workflows, things that happen on the page. And I make the distinction here in this chart that there's dynamic data and then there's dynamic app content. And the real difference there is that dynamic app content means that you just have a ton more flexibility from just dealing with a database that is individual to, let's say, a user or to a company. Again, going back to the examples that we saw on Producthunt, all of these real software tools involve a ton more complex functionality that you really can't get with just a basic content site. So let's just look very briefly at what Bubble does. And again, you're going to get much more of a steep learning curve using a tool like Bubble than a tool like Card, which is why it's really helpful to start out and kind of work your way up. So let's say here in our Bubble application that we're now building software for restaurants to help them manage different things that need to get done in the restaurant. So, your very basic to-do app, but for a restaurant. And, in the concept, this very basic example that we're walking through here, you arrived that this was a software tool that someone was willing to pay for because you created that curation site and you heard from users and your audience members that, hey, we actually need something like this. So you decided to build it. That's where Bubble would come in. So the first thing you see here is there's a sign up button. And just like Webflow and Card, that's just a button element that you drag out. And that's way too big of a button, but that's a normal size button. And just the fact that you're just dragging and dropping things out on a page is one of the disadvantages with Bubble. You're not going to get that tight of design. You could see the templates that I used in Webflow and Card look a lot nicer. And so you're really just trading off some flexibility for the actual nice high-tuned design that you get with those other programs. But it's worth it when you see the stuff you can actually do. So for example, this sign up button here, let's say that we want to sign up a user. There's a template here, a sign up login form that I can drag out. And you'll notice that these input fields have a ton of different options on them. And when I go to this sign up button, there's an option to start edit workflow. When I click on this, I get taken to the workflow page, and there's a lot here because we've just added that sign up functionality. And this is something that we can't do with a tool like Webflow. This is unique to Bubble because we're able to create individual data per user and have users sign in, log in, and track things based on them. So you'll notice that when this button is clicked, we're going to sign the user up, taking their email and password, and then we can create other fields. So let's create a new field, and we'll just call this restaurant. Ooh, can't type. Restaurant name. Field type is text. And we can create an input form. So the input form, we'll just say here, is going to be the value of the reset password value, and then we can change it later on. But what you're seeing here is that if we actually create this site and go to the preview tab, that we have login functionality. In our database here under data types with user, we're going to have a full-fledged user with all of these different fields saved to our database. So then let's say you have a user logged in. Again, we're really just scratching the surface here. There's a ton that you need to learn if you're actually going to use Bubble, but you'll recognize repeating group because it's really just another way of saying display that CMS content that we saw in Webflow. The collection list is equal to a repeating group here. So what type of content do we want to display? Well, we'll go to the data tab and we'll create a new type of data, and we will just call that a restaurant to-do. All right, and that to-do is going to have really just a name and text, and then done, which is just a yes/no question. And just like that, we can go ahead and display, okay, all of, let's say, we've signed up a user, we've done some basic things. Well, now what we can do is we can go ahead and display inside of these repeating groups the dynamic data. First, we need to specify what type of content in here. So this is going to be a restaurant to do. And the data source is we're just going to search our entire database for restaurant to-dos. And we'll just sort by create date, descending here. And now you can see that if we actually click into the text, we can say, okay, display, very similar to what we did with Webflow, display the name of the current restaurant to do. And over here, we can then do a little bit more advanced work, which is a checkbox. And under the label, we'll just say done. And we can make the preset status dynamic. And really all we want to know is if it's the restaurant to-dos done, yes or no. And then the user could have the ability later on to click this checkbox and update that data. So you're beginning to see the makings of a web application with fully formed workflows. So for example, let's just call this delete or create. I can hit start edit workflow and now have a ton of different options here. So in this workflow panel, you can do almost everything, including connect to third-party APIs, display, toggle, reset data, install payment actions with Stripe. Here, what we're going to want to do is delete a thing. So we're just going to delete the current sales restaurant to do. Now we're just going to go to our data tab really quick, and we're just going to go to the app data itself. All restaurant to-dos, obviously we have none, so we're just going to create one. It's not done, and this thing needs to be fixed. Fridge. All right, not the most creative, but we can work with it. So we have something in our database now. We can go back to our design field. We see all of this stuff here. We hit preview, and you'll notice our site doesn't look great, but we see here, this thing that needs to be fixed is the fridge. Done, delete, boom. Just like that, we have a web app that is working with a database. We go back to our app data, and if we refresh here, we should see that to-do is no longer here because we were actually able to delete it on the front end. So going back to this we can see why all of these different tools are needed for different purposes and the trade-offs as you move up with more complex applications that can do more complex things. So again, you're going to get some trade-offs with design. You're going to get great design and super easy to use down here. And as you move up in complexity and need, and because these tools are so different, it's really important that you start out at the right place. So I see way too many startup founders that dive directly into Bubble or directly into Webflow when really they should have started out with a card site. I've also seen the inverse where someone starts out with just a card site and then, they're maybe about 80% done, ready to launch, and they realize, I really needed that dynamic content. So it's super important as a startup founder to take a look at your idea, figure out, what's the goal, where can you put this stuff online, these ideas, and get them tested out accurately. Do you need something that actually functions like an application like Webflow? Do you need a full-fledged software tool to test this out? Or can you start out with just a very basic static content page and then work your way up? But all three tools are awesome. So no matter where you start, I would recommend starting with one of these three. And please let me know in the comments if you find any other really cool tools out there for building apps without code. It's something I'm super interested in. And thanks for watching.